Now, we keep hearing predictions that war in the Ukraine is just days away. Meanwhile, the US and the UK continue to send military hardware and troops to the beleaguered nation. But is the world, particularly the United States, paying attention to the wrong enemy? Well, a former Pentagon defence official says we cannot take our eyes off China, and he believes the US should be sending resources to this region, the Indo-Pacific. I spoke with the respected former national security expert Elbridge Colby earlier this afternoon. Elbridge, it seems odd to me that Western leaders are glued to what Russia may do against Ukraine. Why is this being sold to us as a crucial point in history when we know that China has far more wide-ranging plans?
Well, I think people say in the United States that China is the priority, that things have changed, but they don't really believe it. I think that the sense that Europe and the transatlantic relationship is the center of the world is very, very deeply rooted, especially in the older generation. And we're seeing that right now, that I think the real belief of the president and key figures of the administration and in the Congress as well, among influential journalists, is that, yeah, China is important in a kind of theoretical way, but that really Europe is kind of the central theater, which is a grave mistake that well beyond a tolerable one at this point.
In many ways, it could be said that Russia is merely attempting to return to a previous status quo. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, look, I don't like what Russia's doing. I don't take an understanding attitude towards it in a kind of a moral sense. I deal with it kind of realistically. You know, they've dedicated a lot of effort to restoring their military. They're very resolute on the Ukraine issue. And that's a fact that we have to deal with. I don't necessarily like it, but whether I like it or not is not the real issue. The fact of the matter is that, you know, China has now risen, the world is quaking, and we have to make hard choices. And China and Asia are just far more important than Europe. Europe is important, but we have a scarcity at this point. So whether we like what Vladimir Putin is doing, I mean, he's a nasty guy. I mean, that's the reality. But that's not the thing that should be driving American policy, or I would imagine Australian policy at this point.
And in terms of policy, you've had so much hardware sent from the UK, from the US into that region to try and assist Ukraine. Given what we know is the Russian military, is it a waste of time?
Well, I think in the local area, I mean, it's probably not a waste of time. It's probably going to present complications, but I think it was just being reported that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, was saying that the Russians might be able to be in Kiev if they invaded within a few days. So, look, I think the reality is that the Russians are in a very strong position. And, you know, I do think we should help the Ukrainians, but with the proviso that we need to be doing that after we help, you know, Taiwan and the vulnerable Asian countries. But, you know, there's nothing wrong with helping Ukraine, but that's got to take a backseat to what's happening in Asia.
All of us in Australia know that the US does have presence in our region, but when I think about what China could do at very short notice and occupy Taiwan, what could the US do once that happens? And it could happen very quickly.
Well, look, a couple of things. One thing, I think we know we're in what's called the window, the Davidson window. That said before 2027, you know, they might have the capability. The Taiwan defense minister said recently they might already have the capability to invade and occupy Taiwan. We don't know, but what's very clear is that the Chinese military is incredibly powerful and improving in capability and continues to surprise us. The other reality, Chris, is that the American military is just not strong and big enough to do both, to take on Russia in a realistic way and also take on China over Taiwan, which is a tough course. It's not because we're bad or it's a moral failing. It's a simple fact we're dealing with China as the largest economy to emerge in the international system since the United States itself. And there's a lot of, you know, scarcity, as I said, especially in the kind of key equipment that would be necessary to fight a really high-end opponent like China or Russia. The reality is, Chris, even if we got in a war in Europe or our NATO allies did, my view is that we would need to hold back those capabilities to defend Taiwan even before the Chinese had decided to go. Because, look, the reality is if they see us getting deeply enmeshed or embedded in or invested in a war in Europe, that's going to increase the opportunity. That's going to make it more likely that they go. And if they take over Taiwan, I mean, we're in really bad shape in Asia, and that's the key theater of the world. It's half of global GDP and growing.
Because you'd have to ask the question, if we allow, as Western countries, allow China to occupy Taiwan, take Taiwan, and they do it when the US is so preoccupied with Russia and Ukraine, where's next? What's the next Indo-Pacific territory that they take?
Well, look, I think the reality is, you can look at what people say, but much more reliable is the military they build. We built a military a long time ago to do what's called project power. For a while, the Chinese had what people were calling an anti-access area denial military, basically territorial defense. Well, Chris, they've gone well beyond that, and it's obvious to everybody. They're building aircraft carriers, long-range aviation, nuclear-powered submarines, a space architecture, amphibious marines. This is what you build to project dominant power far from your shores, including, and I would say the next target of their intimidation and potential direct military employment would probably be something like the Philippines or Vietnam. And if the Chinese were willing or able to bring the Philippines to heel, their goal would not be territorial annexation necessarily, but it would be to say, hey, Manila, stop cooperating with the United States, Australia, Japan. Then, I mean, we'd be in really, really serious trouble. And the Chinese, by the way, would be operating in places that we hadn't thought about in this context since the Second World War in the Central Pacific. And that's a world we don't want to get to, and you certainly don't want to get to in Australia, I think.
No, not at all. You've made the link already between what's happening with Russia over Ukraine and what might trigger something in the Indo-Pacific with China moving on Taiwan. There is a connection between the two, and sure enough, in the last 2 months, there have been 2 meetings between Xi and Putin. That's no coincidence, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, I think their statement at the beginning of the Olympics was very revealing. I don't think we've seen a relationship this close, almost intimate in diplomatic terms, between Moscow and Beijing since probably Stalin and Mao. I mean, 70 years ago. It's really bad. I mean, it's really an indictment of American statecraft that we've gotten to this point. Again, it's not that we like these guys, but it's basic geopolitical prudence to keep them, if not fully apart, at least at a decent distance. And that's not where they are. And if they're willing to collaborate actively together, that presents really acute problems for us. So, I mean, who knows what they've been talking about? Xi kind of departed, it seems, from the traditional Chinese position on Ukraine, was quite supportive of Russia's positions. And in the other direction, Putin was very supportive of China's position, not only on Taiwan, but also on the broader issues of alliance, including AUKUS. So they're really at a point where they seem to be collaborating. And this, I mean, again, you never know what they're planning, but you have to be prepared for downside risk. And this suggests to me they're kind of quite close together. Putin obviously is acting in a very manifest way as if he sees an opportunity.
And it's no coincidence, is it, Elbridge, that you've got Russia, China, Iran and North Korea as well, flexing their muscles in their own different way because America under Joe Biden is weak.
Well, look, the way I look at that, I used to kind of roll my eyes back in the old days when my fellow Republicans would criticize various Democrats as weak, and it would always seem like special pleading or the same old thing. But look, the facts speak for themselves. I mean, you've had the Afghanistan debacle, and I thought getting out of Afghanistan was the right decision to focus on Asia and Taiwan, but it was catastrophically handled. But, at the end of the day, we've been talking about Vladimir Putin incessantly for 5 years, and the time that this individual, the president of the Russian Federation, decided was most propitious and opportune to make his move was right now. And, President Biden is in the White House. And I think the Chinese have also pushed. I mean, you saw the behavior in Anchorage, the way they treated Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman when she visited.
Yep.
I think the proof is in the pudding. It doesn't matter what Republicans say. What matters is the behavior of the Chinese and the Russians and others, as you suggest, and that's the most telling signal, which is that this is the time they regard as opportune.
Elbridge Colby, thank you so much for your time. Such an interesting and fascinating insight.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure.